My lady, the next witness is Conor Murphy.
Thank you, Ms Gardner.
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Just
I hope you haven't been kept waiting too long, Mr Murphy.
Thank you.
Could you please state your full name for the inquiry?
Conor Murphy.
Thank you. Mr Murphy, you've given a witness statement to the inquiry. That is INQ 000534957. It is 35 pages long and it is dated the 23rd of January 2025. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
It is, yes.
Thank you. And at the time that you gave your statement, you were an elected MLA. I believe that's now not the case, and you've recently been elected to the Irish Senate. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm now a senator in the Irish Parliament in Dublin.
Thank you. This module of the inquiry is focusing on the period of time when you were Minister for Finance within the Northern Irish Executive. Could you briefly sum up your responsibilities as Minister for Finance in relation to public expenditure and procurement in particular?
Yes, could I just say at the outset, I was unable to give evidence at the scheduled time for at the module in Belfast when the inquiry set in Belfast. So I didn't get the opportunity at that stage to offer my condolences and sympathies to those who have been bereaved through the COVID experience. So I'd just like to take that opportunity to do so now. My job as the Minister for Finance, there were a range of jobs and functions there, but primarily it was to set the budget for the executive, to oversee spending by other departments, to allocate funding that became available through the course of the year from Westminster, and to liaise with Treasury in Westminster. There were a number of other functions in the department then in relation to the collection of property taxes and the management of that system, and also they had an overarching function in relation to procurement for the whole of government, and the Department of Finance did provide a number of services to other departments to assist them with the business that they were carrying out.
Thank you, and we'll touch on some of those services that were provided as we go along, I'm sure. You say that in general terms you were responsible for advising the Executive, the Assembly on control and management of public expenditure, and you also, I believe, had responsibility for the development of procurement policy and legislation within the Assembly. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yes. And during the period that we're discussing, you also chaired the Procurement Board. Was that throughout the period of time of 2020 to 2022? And did it change in any way during that period?
Yes, pardon me, the Procurement Board had previously been chaired by the Permanent Secretary. And when I took up office, there was a discussion that had already developed in the department in the period of time when there were no ministers in charge about the function and I suppose the attendance at the Procurement Board and how to strengthen the procurement guidance that the Department of Finance would issue. So we took an initiative to if you like, take out of the Procurement Board some of the permanent secretaries who had sat there, because it was very much an internal government function, to bring in other practitioners from outside, to bring in a number of other departments had their own procurement function: health, education and infrastructure. But the Department of Finance to provide the service for the rest of the departments. And also then to ensure in terms of procurement's guidance notes, which were the advice that the department produced across a range of areas, to ensure that they had perhaps more of an effect and an imprimatur from the whole executive. So I would take the procurement guidance notes to the executive for approval, which hadn't previously been the case, to give them more strength in terms of that level of guidance and advice to all of the other departments.
And you say in your statement that that reflects a desire to get that level of buy-in, that having approval from the whole executive gives. Is that correct?
Yes, I think there was a feeling in the department that the procurement guidance that was issued by the department would have more effect across. I don't think there was a huge problem, but they certainly felt it would have more effect if the notes were brought through the executive and secured the support of the executive, and in that way they were the property then of each individual department rather than just an advice guidance note from the Department of Finance.
And in terms of the change that you've described in terms of bringing in more procurement expertise, perhaps from each of the relevant procuring bodies, when was that brought into being?
In the early months of 2020.
Very good. And was that a change that was influenced in any way by the pandemic, or was that planned already?
No, I think that had been planned. I mean, the entirety of the plan was not in place when I came into office, because obviously, as an incoming minister, I had to have some input into that. But the general sense of how we needed to bring more people who were actively involved in procurement to make sure that the guidance notes that we produced for all of the departments then had more of an input from people who are at the cold face of procurement rather than simply from a senior level in the civil service.
Mm-hmm.
Mr Murphy, I'm sorry to interrupt. For those of us who speak quickly, it's very difficult to change our speech patterns, but if you could slow down a bit for the benefit of
Okay, I beg your pardon. I get that, thank you.
Thank you. And am I correct that you became Minister for Finance when the executive was reformed on the 11th of January 2020? So you had a very limited period of time with which to get to grips with the role and probably the department to get to grips with you before you were plunged headfirst into the crisis.
That's correct.
Yes. And you said in your statement that you've not identified any direct result of in relation to procurement of the lack of power sharing over the period of 3 years prior to that. But did you find that there were certain policies or there was certain reform that hadn't been introduced in that period of time that then had to be either delayed in terms of implementation because you had to deal with the crisis at hand, or was more difficult to implement as a result of the pandemic?
No, I think that it's not an ideal situation where the executive wasn't in place and you hadn't got ministers taking decisions. But the type of procurement guidance and notes that were being developed and approach to procurement in terms of the board itself were being developed by the civil service in that period. None of them would have really directly related to the challenges that we met in terms of what the COVID experience threw up, the challenges with trying to acquire critical medical equipment. Those would not have been anticipated, I think, had ministers been in post in the preceding time. So I don't believe that there was anything in particular that prevented us from responding to the COVID as a consequence of a lack of procurement preparation over the preceding period.
And we will get to the meat of some of that guidance and reform that was introduced very shortly. I want first to understand some of the structure that existed within the Department of Finance, particularly for you as Minister for Finance to engage with the work of the procurement professionals who were undertaking this work. You mentioned in your statement the PPE Hub. Was this an organisation that, or a body that you engaged with regularly?
No, it was a function that was largely carried out by civil servants. The creation of it would have been agreed by myself and by the executive. It was an immediate and direct response to the challenges that were presenting as a consequence of the pandemic and the need to acquire more material to support health services and indeed other services that the government provided who required PPE. So it was a rapidly moving picture, both in terms of the demand but also in terms of trying to I suppose, assemble a response to that, both at an international level in trying to secure some of the materials, but also at a local level in trying to encourage the provision of certain materials from local manufacturers as well. So that meant that there was a lot of traffic coming into the departments through ministers, people offering services or support, and it was agreed to create a PPE hub as almost like a one-stop shop to make sure that those offers of support and considerations of where materials could be got were brought under one roof, with various agencies then interacting with each other to make sure that all offers were properly assessed and all opportunities were properly explored.
And through what sort of routes would you engage with any issues that arose around procurement and PPE? How did you become aware of those issues?
The CPD, which was the procurement function within the Department of Finance, the people that were then engaging with other departments and with the PPE hub that sat on that would have reported directly to me in relation to feedback as to what was happening and consideration and advice in relation to how to bring matters forward. So Sharon Smith was our direct person in relation to that, but there were other members of CPD directly engaged with procurement. We had, at the start of the pandemic, obviously collectively discussed our approach through the executive, and there was, if you like, a sense of all hands to the pump. And so even though procurement of medical equipment was not the direct responsibility of the Department of Finance, because we had that overarching responsibility, we felt obliged and willing to make an offer to support the Department of Health in its attempts both to secure locally some PPE supplies, but also to assist them in procuring internationally supplies that they needed.
Thank you. And the inquiry has just heard in the previous session from Mr. Matthews from the Department of Health about some of the aspects of governance in Northern Ireland which are unique to that administration, and in particular the concept of lead government department, which in a Westminster context would be DHSC, is quite different, is it not, in relation to Northern Ireland, because the Department of Health during the COVID pandemic was not able to direct other departments. Is that correct? Yes,
that's correct. We do have a unique system of government, which is, I suppose, a consequence of the Good Friday Agreement and the attempt to ensure that there was genuine power sharing across all communities in Northern Ireland. So we have a system of government which gives a significant degree of autonomy to each individual department, and with overarching, if you like, governance from the First and Deputy First Minister's offices. But there is a significant degree of autonomy in the departments, and that was a necessary step in order to get buy-in from all communities to the idea of power sharing in the Good Friday Agreement.
And from your perspective as Minister for Finance, obviously you collaborated a great deal, and we see that in your written evidence with Minister Swan, who was Minister for Health at the time. In a situation such as a global health pandemic or other emergency, does that system of power sharing continue to work, or does it create friction or delays which could hinder effective decision making?
No, I think that there was a genuine attempt across the executive parties to try and collaborate together to respond collectively to what was a very real critical health crisis. There was one party in the executive who disagreed with the direction of travel, the DUP. In terms of some of the health advice we were getting from the Chief Medical Officer or the Chief Scientific Advisor. But the other four parties who were in the executive were very largely on the same script and prepared to follow that and to collaborate together. So there was a difference, not along the traditional constitutional lines, uniquely, I suppose, for our part of the world, but there was a difference. One party was less inclined to agree with the necessity for the measures that were taken during the course of the pandemic, and the other four parties who wanted to follow the advice that we were given. So that did create some tension, but I think there was, even with that, there was a strong level of collaboration across all of the parties and a desire to pool our efforts together to make sure that we responded accordingly.
Thank you. Also want to discuss your collaboration with UK central government and particularly the Department for Health and Social Care. We heard this morning from Ms Bailey from BSO PALS that before the pandemic there was a great deal of particularly FFP3 masks which became very crucial in the response to COVID that were procured directly from DHSC through NHS supply chain, and that there was a realisation in May 2020 that NHS supply chain was not going to be able to provide the PPE necessary to fulfil the demand that there was going to be. Was the Department of Finance, and in particular were you as Minister for Finance, kept abreast of those concerns at the time? And if not, when did you become aware of them?
Well, the interface with the departments in London in relation to health matters were done primarily through the Department of Health, so Finance wouldn't have had any particular role in that regard, in that we interfaced with the Treasury in relation to funding and finances, but not in relation to the equipment that was being supplied, the availability of it, the suitability of it. That was all matters for the Department of Health. So other than hearing general reports at an executive meeting from the Minister for Health, I wouldn't have been very directly involved in any of that.
And I want to have a look at some of your correspondence with the Chief Secretary for the Treasury during this period. If we could get up INQ 000336538. Thank you. This is a joint letter, I believe, dated the 12th of May 2020 to Stephen Barclay, MP, who was the Chief Secretary of the Treasury at the time. And this is a joint letter together with the Ministers of Finance for Wales and Scotland, where you're expressing your what you describe as your collective concerns in regards to the limited supply of PPE being delivered through what was then a proposed UK-wide procurement approach. And you say that this has resulted in the devolved governments incurring significant costs through your own direct procurements, and we'll discuss some of those direct procurements as well. The proposal at this time, if I'm correct, is for a four nations approach to PPE. And is it right to say that this letter expresses some concerns that the devolved administrations will be able to rely on DHSC to deliver on that PPE?
Well, I think it recognises that, firstly, PPE was proven extremely difficult to acquire. The bulk of it was made in the Far East, and that presented logistical difficulties, but also the fact that all countries across the world were basically going to similar buyers to try and secure material meant that it almost had become a frenzy in trying to pursue PPE. The NHS in England had undertaken, and the Treasury had undertaken, to buy that for all parts. So for Scotland, for Wales, for ourselves and for England. But at the same time, given the difficulties that they were having in securing material, were also encouraging us to, for instance, encourage local businesses to repurpose and supply us with material. So, and then also subsequent to that, to explore options ourselves for procuring PPE across the world wherever we could receive that. I think the issue that the letter and ourselves and Scotland and Wales used to meet frequently with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. We would raise various issues in relation to spending generally, but at this period in relation to COVID spending. I think this was to try and ensure that if we were incurring our expenditure on money which had been given to us in a general sense for COVID spend, and we were buying PPE with it, and that we wouldn't suffer as a consequence of the central spend on PPE not coming to us because we had already purchased material, so that we would get the amount that we were due from that as well. So it was really to recognise that although the Four Nations approach, as they called it, had taken a responsibility to try and supply everyone, that was facing difficulties, and we were being encouraged in Scotland, Wales and ourselves to pursue our own options in that regard. So we were trying to make sure that we didn't lose out as a consequence of relation to that.
Yes, and we can see that if we just scroll down a little on this letter, we can see that concern addressed in the what reflected in the first paragraph We need assurance that we will receive funding to meet the costs we have incurred already, and there are suggestions as to how to do that. There is an email exchange that I also want to look at, which reflects some further concerns. That's INQ 000377395. And if we can look at page 2, thank you. This is an email from an official within the Scottish Government, and it's looking at the same approach to a proposed Four Nations approach, where DHSC would manage this PPE fund on behalf of all Four Nations. It notes that that Her Majesty's Treasury believes it to be the most efficient way to procure PPE, but it also notes a couple of concerns. There is a concern about equitable distribution of expenditure. And if we scroll up to the next email, thank you, we see a response from Sharon Gallagher, who I believe is, yes, a Northern Irish official, which reflects her concern, or perhaps Northern Ireland's concern, about the challenges of implementing this protocol and the need to retrofit some account of the expenditure which had already been incurred. Were you aware of these concerns at the time, and how were they ultimately concluded?
Well, the exchange there is, it seems to be within the health departmental systems across Scotland and with ourselves and London. I think the concern, as I outlined in my previous response, was that while they agreed, I think the figure of 7 billion was going to be held centrally to try and secure PPE for all of the regions, that there were difficulties and some challenges in relation to that. And the suggestion was that we move to what the normal distribution of funding is what's known as Barnett consequentials. And you see a reference to consequentials in this email, the normal consequentials process. So if money has been spent additionally to what was originally outlined in the budget in England, then we get the corresponding amount of money into our coffers following the Barnett formula. So I think there was some concern from the health side in relation to the procurement and the involvement of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in relation to decisions on that procurement and the type of equipment, and they thought that it might be an option just to give us the money and try and let us do our own thing.
Mm-hmm. And if we can go back to the previous email that we were looking at, we can see the proposal that was made within this email chain. And they're describing a situation where each administration is an equal partner in a new Four Nations PPE procurement group. It would be looking at future PPE expenditure, and implied in that is that there would be a reconciliation of your past expenditure, but because obviously PPE requirements overlap, the group could secure better value than each administration on their own. Is that is that proposal one that was discussed with Finance, or was that contained within Department of Health?
Well, I think the origins of that discussion were obviously within the Department of Health, because they were responsible for deciding the amounts, the quality, the quantity that was needed, where it was to be directed. As you said, we have a different system of government, so social services is part of our health system, which wasn't necessarily the case in England, Scotland or Wales. We also had other areas of government to supply with PPE, the police, prison officers, other sections. So if there was central procurement through the health department in London, it may not necessarily have tailored for all of the specific needs of ourselves, or for Scotland for that matter, or Wales. And so there was a sense that it might be better if we got access to the resource and were able to tailor the demands. And if those overlapped, then there was a rationale for using what they call a Four Nations approach.
Mm-hmm. And therefore, you are able to deliver on economies of scale and things like that.
Yes, I think so. I think the sense was that we knew what our own specific needs and requirements were, and in the kind of, as I say, the intensity of the procurement exercises that we're going on trying to acquire material, then there was a concern that the further you are from the centre and that, the less your needs are heard or provided for. And I think that was the same feeling for Scotland or Wales, and that was the sense from our health departments, that they had some dissatisfaction with how things were being procured and what was being procured and how much was intended for our specific uses. And obviously then that was related to finance, because we were the people who dealt with the money part of it.
And some of our witnesses to that end and on that topic have expressed some doubt that the concerns of devolved administrations were taken into account at Four Nations meetings in relation to procurement of PPE. Is that what you're describing there?
Yeah, well, I didn't attend the meetings in relation to PPE procurement in particular, so I can't attest to that. As a finance minister, and listening to experience of other ministers in the executive and other ministers in other devolved governments, generally we had the sense of being politely entertained but not really listened to in most matters that we brought to central government in Whitehall. So I think that kind of sense of how we were treated permeated right across both Scotland, Wales, and ourselves in that regard.
I want to bring up, I don't actually need to bring it up, but I do want to briefly touch on the Four Nations protocol for PPE procurement, which was implemented in March 2021, and I believe that is the protocol that stayed in place until the end of the pandemic. That protocol set out that each devolved administration would control its own share of the funding envelope, and also would collaborate on information and intelligence, and therefore you would be able to get better value for money by minimising competition, but also perhaps collaborate on delivering economies of scale and improving resilience. Were you aware of this protocol when it was introduced, and did finance have any contribution to it, or again was that Department of Health's remit?
We wouldn't have had a contribution in that regard to make to it, but we would, because our finance officials worked very directly with the health officials in terms of assisting them in procurement, so they were aware of other developments. It seemed to be a better approach. It seemed to be that there was, at least in that area, some listening had gone on to the devolved regions from central government. But yes, because we would have been assisting the health department in its procurement responsibilities, then our officials would have been aware of some of those discussions, but we didn't have a direct input into those decisions as to how that shaped up.
So that protocol was an improvement on the previous situation?
Well, it certainly seems to answer the criticisms that were put forward, in that the central procurement of PPE didn't necessarily take account of the particular needs of the regions, and that there was little input in terms of decisions in relation to materials and what type of materials. So I think it did appear to meet some of the criticisms that were made in those discussions between the health departments.
And is this sort of thing a protocol that could be in place and then stood up in times of shortages or supply chain breakdown in future, do you think? Is there sense in having this sort of thing in your back pocket, so to speak?
Well, I think that clearly we were all responding to a very rapidly evolving situation, one which was very critical and which was affecting directly people's lives, people's health. So there was an element of trying to keep ahead of the curve in that regard, to try and respond as effectively as we possibly could, to do collaborations where we could with central government in Britain, and to try and secure our own measures to get supplies necessary. So I do think that if a situation like this arose again, and hopefully it won't, but if it did, then the idea that a centralised response has to be more cognizant of the particular demands of the regions, then I think would be of benefit. We wouldn't go through the early misfiring of this approach to get to the point that we got.
And before we move on from this idea of collaboration with other governments, were there opportunities for collaboration with the Republic of Ireland in terms of PPE procurement?
Yes, there are collaborations both north to south in Ireland on a range of health matters, and have been for some time, and there are good working relationships obviously between the health departments. There are also good working relationships which are a formal part of the Good Friday Agreement. So we have a North-South Ministerial Council where on sectoral level ministers meet on a regular basis, and on plenary level twice a year the entire executive and the cabinet in Dublin will meet. So those relationships were already there, and that obviously lent itself to much closer collaboration when we were faced with the challenges of the pandemic.
I want to look at INQ 000130078, if we can. This is a letter from yourself to the Irish Minister for Health. It's dated the 3rd of April. And this is in relation to a particular proposed procurement, which I believe didn't proceed, where it was proposed to collaborate with the Irish government on an order of PPE from China. We understand that from your statement and also from this letter that this procurement at this point was not going to proceed, and you say market conditions in China have become increasingly difficult as other countries have increased their demands on this essential equipment, and we understand that IDA has no further capacity to pursue the collaborative order. Can you expand briefly on why that order didn't go ahead, and is there anything that from the Northern Ireland perspective could have been done differently to have it come to fruition?
Well, I think all administrations, ours and Dublin's administration were no different, had people on the ground in China trying to secure orders on behalf of their administration, and where there was already collaboration taking place between the two administrations. And if we felt that IDA, which is the economic agency in the south of Ireland, was further ahead in perhaps securing, then we had discussed with them the possibility of adding, if you like, an order from Northern Ireland into that and having a joint procurement exercise. This was a very rapidly moving situation, so this was changing not just day by day, but hour by hour in relation to what was happening in China. And there were a large number of orders which had been diverted, with people who had come in with larger checkbooks. And it wasn't just ourselves competing in this field. A lot of countries internationally were competing on the ground in China for PPE. So we had tried to develop a joint order with them. We were agreeing that we would do that. The IDA were on the lead on the ground in terms of their contacts. They then were, I think, of the impression that they could only get enough to satisfy their own needs. They couldn't get the additional amount of order that we had asked them to include in ours. And so we concluded then that that wasn't going to be the case, and that our people on the ground for the Northern Ireland Bureau in Beijing would then pursue their own contacts and try and secure supply for ourselves. So it was, as I say, very rapidly moving. The picture was not just only changing at home in terms of demand, but it was changing internationally, and particularly in China, in terms of who was getting out there, who were securing orders, how much they were paying for them, and how they were shipping that back to the Western Europe.
Thank you. Yes, we can have that off the screen now. Thank you. You mentioned the procurement from China Resources that was ultimately successful, and we had Mr. Losty in last week describing his role in that, and he was frank in describing his own role in that as one of chance or good fortune, that he happened to be evacuated to Northern Ireland in the early stage of the pandemic and happened to have these business contacts. Ultimately, do you think Northern Ireland has the links that it needs with overseas suppliers to procure in a future healthcare emergency, or indeed any civil emergency where supply chains become an issue?
Well, I think that Mr. Lusty underplays his role. I think it was very critical in securing supply for us. I mean, we are a very, very small player internationally. We're not a large economy. We're not a large nation, and we we were very much, down the queue when it came to people competing for PPE orders in China. Tim Lusty used his own personal connections that he had built up as the Northern Ireland Executive's representative in Beijing for a number of years at that point, and managed to secure us a contract, which I think when you see some of the exchanges from Scotland and Wales, they were, and indeed from London, that we had managed to secure that ourselves was a matter that raised some eyebrows, given how small we were in the international stage. So I think that, of course, it does point to the fact that our offices, and there are offices all over the world, even with small entities like ourselves, that we do need to continue to make those local contacts. They're not only beneficial in broader economic terms, in terms of doing business, but in more critical terms, then those contacts are very, very important. I think also the lesson from that, and I know that you have touched on this, was to ensure, and it's part of the advice that I had given to the executive, that the supply chains needed to be looked at in terms of their resilience. And that was, for me, the singular big lesson in terms of procurement from the pandemic. There are a lot of other health lessons to be learned, but in terms of procurement, to make sure that all your eggs weren't essentially in the one basket in terms of getting critical medical supplies.
Thank you. And you've provided details of a PPN, a procurement practice note, on supply chain resilience that you issued during the period of the pandemic on that topic. And we won't bring it up, but is it fair to summarise it as emphasising the importance of modelling the supply chain, having sight of the length of the supply chain generally, but also the advantage of shorter supply chains, and building in that flexibility and responsiveness so as to weather these types of events?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think in terms, generally speaking, on supply chains, we have to have an account of carbon footprint. So if people just pursue things on the basis of cheapest price, they generally find that they're made in the Far East, not exclusively, but generally speaking, where labour costs are cheaper. But that leaves them a long way away from you, particularly critical supplies, if you face into an emergency. So it was an opportunity not just to make a contribution environmentally, but also economically in a local sense, to make sure that people who could provide some of this equipment could repurpose their manufacturing to supply some of this equipment were encouraged to do so. And that was the purpose of that procurement note. That had already happened as a consequence of the kind of called arms from the executive during the pandemic, that people did step forward and make material that was critical for our health services. And we wanted to ensure that that lesson was learnt and applied into the future.
What sort of support did the Department of Finance give those companies in Northern Ireland who wanted to repurpose perhaps existing manufacturing equipment to produce much needed healthcare supplies?
Well, we couldn't really give them any direct support. I mean, we were supporting companies generally because we had funds to distribute as a part of the response to the COVID pandemic for the shutdown of businesses. But in some ways, the encouragement in this area allowed some of these businesses to reopen and just to make some I suppose, business for themselves in terms of responding to the needs of the health service locally for the pandemic. So it wasn't a matter of financial support or inducement. It was to say to people that if you can make this material, that there is a market for it here, there is a health service which needs this material on an ongoing basis, and that hopefully beyond this pandemic they will look, given the advice that we had given them in terms of shortening supply chains, that they and other departments will look to the local economy in the first instance for things that can be manufactured locally.
And you've given us many examples in your witness evidence of companies that did rise to that call to arms, as it were, and provide PPE and other equipment. Can you give us any insight into the current situation, or perhaps given your recent departure from the executive, the recent situation in Northern Ireland? Is that manufacturing base still there, or is it capable of being scaled up or repurposed if a similar health emergency, which might require different equipment in a future event, is that still there, or is that being dismantled?
Yes, we do have a very strong manufacturing base in Northern Ireland, and one which has some international reputation. We don't have natural materials in terms of supply, so that will always be a challenge for us. But I think that there are companies there who are still supplying, perhaps. And I don't have firm evidence of this, I only have a sense anecdotally as I went on to become the economy minister, so I had some interaction with business, perhaps not at the level I would have wanted to see in terms of a continuation of contracts to make sure that we actually encourage and built up a bank of businesses and manufacturers that could support particularly critical supply for us in response to any future pandemic. So I would hope that in the Northern Ireland Executive those lessons have been learnt and that they are carried on into the future.
Thank you. And finally, in the same vein, in terms of increasing supply chain resilience, the Northern Ireland Audit Office report, which I know you've seen, has a recommendation to the whole of the executive on building supply chain resilience, and one aspect of that it highlights is reducing this reliance on emergency procurement. As you are responsible for procurement policy during this time, what measures did you implement, or do you think ought to be implemented to reduce that urgent emergency procurement, which is naturally less cost effective?
Well, there's always a challenge there, because that's a balance between procuring a lot of supply which then isn't used and becomes waste, and you become subject to some criticism for having bought materials that is, outlives its shelf life and is not used. So the balance is in ensuring that you're ready for some measure of emergency, but not stockpiling to the extent that it becomes a waste of money. So that's always a fine line in which all government departments, I think, will walk. I think the more that we had ensured that at the very least that supply chain was closer to home, then it meant that we weren't run into the logistical challenges that there were during a global pandemic of trying to get supply. So I think I would hope that those lessons are learned, that if there is critical supply that can be manufactured on the island of Ireland, or indeed between Ireland and Britain, that is a much easier accessible supply of material than would be the case about trying to go to the Far East to find it.
Thank you. My lady, those are all my questions. I believe the core participants also have some.
Thank you very much, Ms Gardner. I think it's Ms Campbell.
Mr Murphy, thank you. I ask questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. I have three topics too, which in fact you've touched on, so we can deal with them quite briefly. I want to revisit the issue of cross-border cooperation, and we looked at the letter that you had sent to Simon Coveney, and we've discussed briefly the proposal for joint procurement that didn't quite work out. The flip side of that coin, if you like, was that in China, Tim Losty, and we heard from him, I think this day last week, but he told the inquiry that towards the end of March, he was in contact with the Irish ambassador in Beijing. So you were in communications, if you like, between North and South. And he was in Beijing, really discussing the same opportunity as it arose. But it became quickly apparent that the Irish negotiations were at a stage at which it was too late, essentially, for the Northern Irish requirements to be piggybacked onto that order, because they had maxed out their requirements. And that's what you find as well. Is that fair?
Well, I think that was the ultimate end point of it. The fact is that situation was, as I said in my previous answer, was changing on an hourly basis, not just on a daily basis. So I think it was very, very late in the day when we were very much, I think, confident that a joint order was being made and the material was there, that we learnt very late in the day that that wasn't available and that the joint order couldn't be pursued. So, yes, that's what ultimately happened. But as I say, it was in a very rapidly changing environment.
It was indeed. And we know not only were things happening and changing on the hour, and the world was scrambling for PPE, and Northern Ireland was a very small fish in a very large ocean at this point in time. And so, bearing all of that in mind, we're now at the end of March and beginning of April. Is there an argument that those discussions with the Irish government should have happened at an earlier point in March to enable you to be participants in that order before it was placed or before discussions commenced?
Well, I don't have the detail with me as to when that order was placed. So again, I suppose all agencies and all representatives, particularly on the ground in Beijing and in China, generally from all governments all over the world, were moving very quickly to try and secure their own PPE. I think by the time we became aware that they were more advanced than perhaps we were, and there may be an opportunity through informal dialogue, obviously, on the ground in Beijing between the officials, but also between ourselves and government ministers in the south, there may have been an opportunity to tack on an order, if you like, to that. And we tried to develop that. It looked promising, and then at the last moment, it didn't materialise. So it's hard to make a judgment now as to how soon in that process we could have known that an order was materialising, and that whether that would have had a material effect in terms of getting our own supply in that. Obviously, people like Tim Lusty then moved immediately to secure our own order, which we did in the weeks after that.
Thank you. You've also touched on the issue of coordination amongst the DAs and with the London government. And again, before we leave Mr Lusty, he indicated both in his statement and in evidence last week that he felt that the UK government sometimes came across as disinterested in working with or hearing the concerns of the devolved administrations. In fact, in evidence, he said that he felt some of the issues that were being raised by the DAs, particularly in Four Nations calls, deserved a greater degree of discussion and consideration and debate than that they ultimately received. Does that chime with your experience, and as much as a Minister of Finance, you had, I think you've told us this morning, the sense of being, or this afternoon, a sense of being politely entertained, but not really listened to?
Well, I can't speak to the direct experience in terms of health because I wasn't involved in those discussions, but my general sense of dealings with Whitehall at that time and subsequently as Economy Minister were chime with that of getting an audience but not having any impact in terms of decision making. I had many discussions at that time with my counterparts in Scotland and Wales. I think it wasn't just felt by us, it was felt by Scotland and Wales also.
Ms Gardner drew your attention to the Four Nations Protocol on PPE procurement, which ultimately I think comes into fruition in March 2021, so a good 10 or 11 months on from some of the documents that we looked at in spring 2020. Do you have any sense as to why it took until March 2021? I
don't, because I wasn't involved in the direct discussions on those health matters. It was the health department who was dealing specifically with the administration in Whitehall and the other administrations in Scotland and Wales in relation to those matters directly. We were just assisting the health department, given the broad experience of procurement in the finance department. So I don't know why it took so long, but I make an assumption that everyone was reacting to a pandemic and trying to do the system of government at the same time, but it perhaps is attributable to the fact that it takes a long time, if at all, for Whitehall to listen to what the devolved administrations are saying to them.
Finally then, on the topic of lessons learned, you conclude your statement at paragraph 90 with a reference to your former department's production of a lessons learned document. And I just want to look at it very quickly and not in any detail. It's INQ, there we are, 000494732. It's a 4-page document. You see the first date is the 2nd of April 2020. We can then see the 8th of April, a date at the end of May. And can we just very quickly scroll down through the 4 pages? We will inevitably look at the substance or the content of this document in more detail in a different way. First question, the document's not dated. Do you have any sense of when it was issued as a lessons learned document from the Department of Finance?
I think I don't recall the exact date. I think from memory, before the inquiry started, that there was material sent around various government departments. I would not have been in the Department of Finance at that time to ask us for a general sense of how things were done and what lessons might be learned from that. So it's probably sometime in the period around when the inquiry was beginning its work.
So, and in response to the inquiry's work?
Yes, I think that's I think that's what it was, yes.
The earliest date referred to it, we can see there, is the 2nd of April 2020. And in fairness, it's not really clear why that date is particularly chosen. But the document itself doesn't seem to engage with the issue of if you like, pre-pandemic preparedness, or what might have happened throughout February and into March in terms of putting the department in perhaps a more resilient or structured position? Should it?
Well, this relates to the Department of Finance, and I
Right.
suppose most of the focus of preparedness really would fall more in a general sense to the Executive and the First and Deputy First Minister's Office in terms of civil contingencies, or directly to the Department of Health, because it was a health crisis, a health pandemic that we were facing. So perhaps it isn't as clear as what lessons might be learned across the range of other departments. I do think that there are, of course, in any of these experiences, there are lessons to be learned, and I would hope that the experience of the pandemic is, through the work of the inquiry and the analysis that will come from that, then applied to make sure that we are in a better prepared state should such a situation arrive again. I don't think that the administration in Northern Ireland is unique in that terms of not being fully prepared for the extent of a pandemic that faced us. But I think, of course, the experience, the analysis that will come through this inquiry and the kind of, I suppose, self-examination across each of the administrations then hopefully will make people in a better state of preparedness should such a situation arrive again. At the very least, we will have the experience of that to draw on in terms of a response.
Thank you. Those are all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Murphy. Those are all the questions we have for you. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to hear from you when we were in Belfast, but thank you for the help that you've given to the inquiry.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
My lady, I'm going to pass over to Mr. Sharma.
Thank you. Mr. Sharma.
My lady, the next witness is Major General Philip Prosser.
Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Major General Prosser, I hope you were warned that you were the last witness of the day. I hope you haven't been hanging around for too long.
Not at all, my lady. Thank you.
General Prosser, good afternoon. You have already provided the witness, the inquiry, with two witness statements. The references are INQ 000 560895 and INQ 000 538 647. Would you confirm that they are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are true.
You are Major General Philip Prosser. During the pandemic, you held the rank of Brigadier Commander of the 101 Logistic Brigade. Is that right?
That's correct.
And between the 19th of March of 2020 and the 23rd of July of 2020, you were deployed, were you not, to assist the PPE team within the NHS England headquarters at Skipton House?
I was.
The inquiry has heard a lot of evidence about the procurement of PPE, but less about its distribution, that is, getting the kit that was brought to the front line. Could I ask you, please, to begin with your experience in logistics and just an outline of what the 101 Logistic Brigade is?
Yeah, of course. So 101 Logistic Brigade is part of the 3rd United Kingdom Division, which at the time was the UK's warfighting force, primary warfighting force held at readiness. I had 17 units delivering 3 basic functions, or 3 important functions. The first was delivering engineering support to frontline vehicles to make sure we could fix them as far forward on the battle space as possible. Second was the delivery of combat supplies, so from ammunition all the way to clothing and rations to the forward line of the battle space. And then the third one is medical support as well, so looking at casualty extraction and setting up enhanced surgical capability forward on the battle space. So those 3 capabilities came under my command.
And it's right, isn't it, that you have served in the armed forces for some 28 years?
At the time, yes.
and you've served in Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yes.
Could I turn, please, to what is described in your witness statement as a MACA request? Could you just please, in very broad terms, just outline what a MACA request is?
Yeah, so it's military aid to the civil authorities. The Civil Authorities Act says that civil authorities will react to crisis in the homeland, but in extreme circumstances, if the military or any other government department have a capability that is needed in an emergency, for the military, we place a military, we put a MACA task in that asks the military for help, and then that goes through a scrutiny check to say if this is a capability that cannot be provided elsewhere, then the military will step in and provide that support.
And in terms of a MACA request, does it have limits as to what it can ask you to do?
Yes, so it is about delivering something that nobody else can deliver. So the military, I think the MOD in this sort of circumstance should be seen as almost the last resort. And it is something that nobody else can deliver or in the time frame that they can deliver. And the way we make sure that there isn't mission creep or growth is to try and put some boundaries on it to make sure that we deliver what we're meant to deliver, and then we can go back to our core purpose.
Thank you. I wonder if we could please bring up a MACA request, or rather an email that leads to the request. It's INQ 000534264. These are emails between the Ministry of Defence and NHS England on the 19th of March of 2020, so at the very beginning of what was an emerging crisis in the procurement and distribution of PPE. And could we turn to page 4, please? This is it. Please accept this email as a formal notification of a request for military support for NHS England. And then if we just scroll down the page, it just outlines in broad terms the scale of the crisis which NHS England and SCCL were experiencing. It says just at that first bullet point, NHS England lacks the necessary planning and logistic task at this scale in the time frame available. The supply chain is under pressure. The NHS supply chain is unable to recover sufficiently within the next 24 to 72 hours. And then if we can scroll down, please, just those bullet points in the middle of the page, deficiencies to the current structure, no national planning capability to meet unprecedented national demand, no NHS supply chain capability to meet unprecedented national demand. And then the proposal dash request, logistics expertise and support for the immediate and interim distribution of PPE across the NHS estate in order to undertake and complete the following. And then it goes on to list a large number of tasks. And perhaps we'll come back to the division as to what the MACA request did and didn't cover during the course of your evidence. Could we go, please, to page 2 of that document before we take it down? This is just to summarise what the position was at and around about that date, at least from the perspective of NHS England. The NHS supply chain for PPE is falling apart. They urgently need assistance. This is a large-scale request. There's no commercial capability within the time frame. And then the final lines, please treat this as the first report from the battlefield. Details will change, but the base problem of PPE supply chain risk is very real. More to follow. Now, in your written evidence, you describe the Ministry of Defence and your team being effectively immediately deployed in order to assist with this request. Is that broadly right?
That's right, yes.
And 2 people were deployed to NHS England on the afternoon of the 19th of March, and then you arrived on the 20th of March.
That's right.
Just to provide us with an idea from your vantage point, was what was being described in this email broadly consistent with what you saw?
Yeah, I think so. I guess there's 2 aspects to that. First of all, I think this was a description of all the problems rather than what they actually wanted me to do. And I think there's a line here, the 4th line down. maybe as large as 25 trucks, this is quite a bounded problem. And then, in the next line, to establish a full end-to-end supply chain, those are two extremes of a problem. So I think the email, first of all, described what the big problem was. And I was called the night of the 19th to say we're going up to the NHS next day. It's about delivering PPE using trucks. But when I arrived in Skipton House, I realised that it was much, much more. So this is definitely a description of what the situation was on the ground. But I needed a bit of time to understand exactly what we needed to do.
When you were deployed and you were working with NHS England, was your role in any ways connected to procurement, or was it entirely operational?
It was entirely operational, but because I think as the situation unfolded, it was first a logistics and distribution challenge, and then became a supply and procurement challenge. And those two things sort of existed at the same time, but one was bigger than the other at certain times of the operation. So I wasn't involved with the actual procurement, but of course, as I was focusing on distribution, I needed to know what was coming in. So I worked with the procurement team, but didn't do procurement.
Just some questions, please. You refer in your statement to the PPE distribution network being jammed. That's one of the expressions in your statement. Could you describe to the inquiry, please, what is it that you mean by jammed, and what was causing that jam?
Yeah, so this is similar to Emily Lawson's evidence. So Unipart had 7 regional distribution centres, and
If I can just ask you to pause there. So Unipart were a subcontractor of SCCL, someone
Yes.
who we've heard evidence from, and Unipart's task was essentially to be leading on distribution. It was subcontracted by SCCL, is that right?
Yeah, exactly that. Sorry, I should have said that. So SCCL subcontracted to Unipart, who then had 7 regional distribution centres around the country to serve each of the NHS regions. And then we had the 8th centre, which was a storage facility in Haydock, run by Movianto, where the PIP stock was based. My understanding from the situation on that first weekend was the distribution centres were just... So in a distribution centre, without going into too much technical detail, you have a large open space where stuff coming from the supplier would be placed as soon as it arrives in the distribution centre. So if you're buying from a glove manufacturer, you will get a lorry full of gloves. But of course, you're not going to deliver a lorry full of gloves to a hospital. You're going to deliver gloves, masks, etc. So you need to break down the gloves. So you need an open area to break down the gloves and then put them on the shelf. And then you need another open area where you take 20 gloves, masks, custard powder, as I've heard from other people's evidence, put that in a lorry and then deliver that cross-commodity, multi-commodity delivery to the hospital. And as I couldn't understand it, and just looking at some of the evidence, Emily's asked by the Chief Executive on the 10th of March to look at trusts not getting their goods. As early as end of January, we hear about demand management being put in place because people are starting to order more than they ever have. And as I understood it at these distribution centres, as staff absence was increasing because COVID was going on, people were shielding, people had elderly parents, etc. Some people had COVID. People were over-ordering. So these open areas were becoming fuller. So you couldn't break down the gloves that arrived from the supplier. Then you lacked this open space. So it was harder to get stuff into the distribution centres and harder to get it out. And just slowly, it must have been February and March, my sense was that the network had just become clogged.
And that clogging was caused by not only the increased demand, but also the fact that people who might have been working in those centres were shielding or had caught COVID themselves. Was that one of the other problems?
Yeah, that was my understanding. That was certainly the brief that we had on that first weekend.
A number of personnel were deployed. You refer to 312 personnel being deployed over the next 2 weeks. Was it their job, essentially, to help to unblock that jam?
Yes, so they went in, and it was, it was like a large Tetris challenge. So you need to take something out of the open space in order to break the stuff down that has come into, the inbound stock and put it on the shelf in order to then create space for the outbound. So the team went in, I think it was 312 for between 12 and 20 days, and just worked long hours, put temporary accommodation, temporary warehousing up outside with tents, etc., made some space, and then, did what would have probably taken, 4 to 6 weeks. They did that in 1 to 2 weeks. So they created that space to allow the flow of goods again.
So a major operation, essentially, to unblock that problem within 20 days. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I'd like to take you forward just a little bit in the chronology to a meeting on the 21st of March, which you had with Jin Sahota, who was the CEO of SCCL. You've referred to the role of Unipart and SCCL. Could you take us through a little bit about what happened at that meeting and what you or the MOD were being asked to do?
Yeah, so the immediate deployment hadn't happened yet. So this is my second day. We arrived on the 20th, so this is my second day. And it was the Saturday morning, and Jin, and I think his supply chain director was there as well. And they took us through exactly what SCCL was. And, I was new to the NHS, so I needed a fairly basic brief on exactly what it was. And we heard, you've heard from Emily Lawson about the towers, etc. And, it's quite a complicated structure. And he talked to us about what SCCL was, how it was set up, all the background to it, some of the challenges they were facing, some of the increased demands, challenges of supply. And I just remember at the end he said, look, and we can't scale anymore. And that's backed up by some of the other evidence I read in preparation for the inquiry. Emily the week before has talked to SCCL about increasing capacity, SCCL and Unipart about increasing capacity. Gareth Rees-Williams has said, look, you might have increased capacity now, but you might have to do it ×8 again. So all these conversations were happening before I arrived. So, and then Jin finished and said, look, we can't get any bigger, so somebody needs to set up another network, and it's got to be the MOD. And it's not, having gone from 25 trucks for 4 days to suddenly running quite a major distribution mission sort of took me back slightly. So we just left it there. I said, look, I need to go away and understand a bit more about this, Jin.
So to go back to the beginning of your evidence in terms of what you were expecting and your team were expecting to do, was there in your mind a risk of mission creep? Of what you were being asked to do to potentially expand further than the initial MACA request?
Yeah, after that conversation, I realised that, somebody might have, and that was a personal view from Jin. I don't think he shared that with certainly anybody in the NHS. But I did get the sense that actually this might be much bigger than what I was prepared, what the Army should have been, what the MOD should have been prepared to do. So at that moment, I realised, yes, this was, much more serious, much more urgent than I had appreciated before I arrived, and that risk of mission creep was significant.
What, based upon your experience in logistics and your wider experience, what would it have meant if the MOD and your team needed to be expanded in terms of that level of personnel? What numbers of people were you thinking about?
Well, I think it would have been, and I don't know how many people were employed by the whole Clipper operation in the end. Perhaps that would have been a good question to ask. But my sense would have been anything between 5,000 to 8,000 soldiers. And once we'd have set that up, it would have taken probably 18 months to 2 years for us to extract from it, depending on how much of the setup we did. So it would have been a significant ask, and it would have undermined the MOD's ability to deliver against its primary role.
That primary role, if I can ask some questions about that, please. One of the areas of your written evidence which you are conscious of, and the MOD is conscious of, is being drawn away from that primary role. Could you just describe a little bit, it may be obvious, but as to what that primary role is, because it's not necessarily logistics and distribution during a pandemic.
No, and it's so the MOD role is to keep the country safe and help it prosper, which is probably the overarching purpose. But below that, within 3rd United Kingdom Division, my role was to deliver logistic support to the warfighting division, and that was about fighting an enemy overseas.
And so in terms of the risk in your mind at the time, and perhaps the risk to your colleagues, was that if this demand on the MOD and on military support continued to expand, it would jeopardise the primary function of the MOD and the military, which is defence of the country.
Yes, and there was a secondary threat. We didn't, this is still early days. So this is the 21st, so 2 days before lockdown. We also don't know what's going to happen with COVID-19. So if we needed to reinforce other government departments for short periods, we couldn't be fixed on one big task. We needed to remain that flexible in order to reinforce other government departments if need be for short periods of time. So one, we didn't want to take away from the primary role. And equally, we didn't want to get fixed on a single task either.
And in terms of the risks, and of course we're talking now about a situation that was 5 years in the past, but what were the risks, what were the geopolitical risks that were in your mind at the time and the MOD's mind at the time?
Yeah, so it was a different, obviously, it was 2 years until 2 years later for the second illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Crimea had happened a few years previously and geopolitical tension was always there. So part of deterrence is being seen to have a credible warfighting force to deploy at any time. So geopolitically, it was 2 years before Ukraine. It was 5 to 6 years after the first illegal invasion of Crimea. So things weren't safe. But importantly, deterrence is about being seen to have a credible warfighting force. And if that warfighting force is fixed, delivering a peacetime or a homeland contingency task, then you're going to undermine that credibility of that deterrence.
Thank you, General Prosser. My lady, I wonder if that's a convenient moment. I'm going to move on to another topic.
Certainly, Mr. Sharma, and also I'll try and get rid of the northern lights behind me. I'm sorry about that. I think it's the sun's come round. Very well, I shall return at 3:15. Mr. Sharma.
General Prosser, Clipper Logistics is the next subject of my questions. You referred earlier to a number of issues with Unipart, and they would be solved by the engagement of Clipper Logistics to come and assist with warehousing, logistics and distribution. Could you help us, please, with who Clipper Logistics were and how they came to be involved in the distribution effort during the pandemic?
Yeah, of course. So just to sort of back up and get to that point, in chronology terms, we've had the conversation with Jin on the Saturday morning. I'm looking at the Unipart system being clogged. We come up with a plan Saturday night, Sunday morning to deploy the 312 soldiers. But I know that's only a short-term fix. That's about unlocking what we've got. But going back to the conversations that had happened the week before, we knew we needed more capacity. And SCCL there was something blocking it. And I think, digitally they couldn't do it. Their systems couldn't expand. Physically, they weren't presenting options about extra warehousing. And then Jin suggests this is what the MOD can do. So I'm in a position where I'm trying to make sense of, okay, once we've created the flow through the distribution centres, we need more capacity, and there didn't seem to be a plan. So Neil Ashworth, who was, I think he was Chief Commercial Officer at the time for Yodel. I can't remember whether he was still in that role or had just finished, and he'd been Supply Chain Director for Woolworth and Tesco's. But he was a member of an organisation called, at the time, the Engineer Logistics Staff Corps, now called the Staff Corps, which is a Group B Army Reservist unit. And they are recruited from people in specialist organisation engineer logistics, back in the day. They do much wider communications, cyber and digital now. But they are a group of experts, reservist officers, so they can wear uniform, who provide us solutions in time of operational challenges. As an example, it might be quite useful just to understand, in Iraq in 2003, we tried to open the port, the army tried to open the port in Qasr, but there were some problems with the handling facility at the port. So ferries, roll-on, roll-off ferries couldn't come alongside and offload. A member of the Engineering Logistics Staff Corps worked for a large maritime operation and was able to source one of these pieces of equipment, bring it over from a nearby Middle East country and solve the solution in 24 hours. So that's the sort of capability they bring. Neil Ashworth had been appointed to me about 6 months earlier as my mentor, so I phoned him up. I'm faced with this challenge of I need more network capacity. SCCL and Unipart are saying they've reached their capacity and can't expand.
Could I just interrupt you for a moment? What do you mean by network capacity?
So that's the warehousing and distribution. So we talk about network as the shed, it's the trucks and sheds. So it's where you store your stock and how you distribute it.
Right.
So there seems to be no facility to increase warehousing, and therefore once you've increased your warehousing, you need to increase the distribution because you're delivering from more sites. So I phoned Neil, and I think it was the Sunday morning, and he said, it sounds as if you need a new partner. And I said, yeah, it does, but this isn't something we do in the military. How do I do that? And he said, I've got, I know Clipper are down. I didn't realise how many logistics people know each other from across the industry. And he said, Clipper, a lot of their market is the retail. High Street was closed. They've got a lot of capacity, and they're really good at this agile stuff. And he said, do you want me to connect them to SCCL? And he had contacts in SCCL and Unipart. And I said, yeah, please. That would be absolutely fantastic. Let's scope the feasibility of this and see what happens.
And so just to be clear, you put them in contact with other people, but did you have any role in the structuring of the relationship between SCCL, Unipart and Clipper? No,
I saw the role of the military. I should have said it up front, this isn't something the military did on our own. We worked with the NHS as a really high performance team, and it was a really proud moment for me to be part of that team. So everything we did was with NHS, with DHSC, with all the consultants that came along with that. And I often saw the military role as being the catalyst or being the oil in the cogs of those teams to just speed things up. And this is a great example of that. So understand the problem, come up with some choices, and then try and make it happen as quickly as possible, but make others make the decision for themselves.
What you're describing, if I may say so, in terms of Clipper Logistics and those with whom you had contact with, was a mix of military experience and commercial or retail expertise was what was being brought together. Is that right?
Yeah, it's exactly it. It's the blend. It's the blend. And I often talked when I was with the NHS, but I think we brought 4 things from the military. We brought discipline, tempo, a different way of thinking, and then the resilience, because this was long days for long periods of time. And the military are used to pushing ourselves quite hard. So we brought that level of resilience into a team that was, having to work really, really hard. So in terms of that discipline and tempo, it was, having the discipline to get to the core of what the problem was, and then having the tempo to actually come up with some choices, and then, get on with the plan as quickly as we can. But again, not making the decisions, just having presenting the information as quickly as the right information, as effectively as possible to make the decisions quickly.
In your written evidence, you describe instilling a wartime mindset amongst those with whom you were working, and instilling a speed and pace of working which you didn't see was there, at least when you arrived, and that needed to be pushed. Could you help us with that, please? What were the things that were slowing the distribution down? What were the blockers that were in your way?
Well, so in terms of the blockers, the distribution centres were the biggest one. Right in the early phases, it was the distribution centres.
The distribution centres, you mean the infrastructure, the actual warehousing as to where all of this picking and packing was going on?
Yeah, and they were clogged. So it wasn't doing anything about it. That's what, we seem to be, and Emily refers to her evidence that there was no forecasting of what needed to be bought. There was no forecasting of how we were going to bring the extra capacity online. External agencies were sort of, answering emails in 2 days' time. And I think at that stage, it's, I had to go through that acceleration myself. I arrived on the 20th, and remember, on the Saturday, we'd gone through the analysis, and then Emily came down, and, having read the evidence and what had happened before I arrived, I now realised the pressure that frontline healthcare workers were under and the NHS staff were under in trying to establish this PPE supply chain. And I remember on Saturday night, I sort of said to Emily, hey, look at my analysis. And she said, you haven't done anything yet. That's the pressure that everybody was under. And you just needed that moment to realise, actually, we need to switch. And this is not about 2 days now. This is about 2 minutes to respond to your emails. And very slowly, as lockdown happened and the whole situation changed, I think much more of the organisation got put on that war footing. But over that weekend, that was my acceleration, and we watched others go through the same thing.
One of the groups that you established was something called the immediate replenishment groups. What were they and why were they necessary?
So over that first weekend, as I accelerated onto a war footing, we tried to work out what we'd been asked to do. It wasn't about driving trucks, it was more than that. And one of the tasks I set my team was, what is our binding purpose here? I believe high-performance teams have a purpose, a plan that delivers against the purpose that everybody owns, and then the team who truly believe in that purpose, who own the plan and then deliver against it. And we wanted them to understand, what is that purpose? And somebody said, look, this isn't about delivering masks, this is about instilling confidence in the frontline healthcare workers. This is about making sure they get up in the morning and know they're going to feel safe and be able to go out and do their jobs. So one of the jobs, so as part of that, I needed to make sure that people could see that if they were in crisis, we would respond. So we had the NSDR, which was the National Supply Disruption phone call service.
And that
response.
and forgive me, that was something that was established during the EU exit process as part of the contingency planning.
Yeah, that's right.
That was something that was able to be stood up during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's right. So everybody knew the phone number. If they were facing the challenge in their supply, they had the number. And then I wanted people to respond really quickly. So I established an IRG immediate replenishment group in the south and one in the north. So if anybody in the dark of night felt as if they were running out of PPE, some soldiers in a truck would appear and just give them that response to get them through the next day.
Sitting where you were, there were two sides to this distribution equation. There was the inbound logistics problem, and then there was the outbound logistics problem. Could you help us, please, with what were the challenges with the inbound logistics, the items that were arriving from overseas and being procured within the UK?
Yeah, so what we had was a new supply chain. And again, a lot of people have given their evidence about the buy team. Andy Wood, I thought, did a great job of describing how he was trying to bring this disparate team together. And as part of we had a new buy team, we had a new supply base. And distribution had changed as well. So traditionally, I think SCCL would have bought goods, including transport. So when they went onto contract, they would have known when it would have been delivered to one of their distribution centres, and they could book it in, and it was all very stable. But now we're using new suppliers. We don't have an international distribution system that we can just use. So we have to create that as a new system. And we've got new people, new contracts, new suppliers in a shifting supply base. So because contracts were being, deals were being done very quickly, you weren't getting the certainty that you would have had in peacetime for delivery dates. So they might say, 26th of March, you're going to get X number, but 26th March will come and it will go and they won't have arrived. And because we haven't got that line of sight or a certain line of sight to that delivery, it makes a distribution operation really challenging. The life as a logistician or a supply chain expert is about balancing demand and supply. And we're learning about the demand signal, and a number of witnesses have talked about that. And the supply chain looking backwards has now is falling apart or changing and evolving. So we've got no certainty of what we need to deliver and no certainty of when we're going to get it. So this is the worst case.
So essentially what's happening is that the buy team are making their purchases with an estimated date of delivery of that equipment from overseas, China in particular, but other markets around the world.
Yes.
But no one really knows precisely as to when that's going to arrive and what the demands are going to be on that distribution system. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And that's nobody's fault. Pragmatically, that is a sign of the times. And I know, Milady, you referred to chaos in Emily Lawson's evidence. It was full on, to quote Emily. And it's entirely pragmatic that, manufacturers in China who are now serving multiple more customers that they've ever served before are finding it difficult to plan themselves. So this is just a sign of the operational pressure that everybody is under across the end-to-end supply chain.
We'll come back to it perhaps at the end of your evidence. One of the areas which the expert to the inquiry, John Manners-Bell, described as an issue was supply chain visibility.
Yeah.
And we'll come perhaps onto that when we deal with recommendations. But if I could turn please to another topic, which is Daventry and the operation at Daventry. We know that Clipper established a centralised national distribution centre of 260,000 square feet at Daventry, and that was the main site for the storage and distribution of PPE during the pandemic. And one of your colleagues, Lieutenant Colonel Dutton, was based at Daventry. You, on the other hand, were based at Skipton House.
Yes.
Could you describe to the inquiry the nature of that liaison with Lieutenant Colonel Dutton and what his role was in Daventry and how that helped you with your job?
Yeah, so it was just having eyes forward, and there are actually two people in Daventry that really helped us run the operation there, but run with Clipper as part of the subcontractor Unipart. So there was Eb Mukhtar, who was who works for a Google supply chain, and then Ed Dutton, who works for Amazon. So supply chain experts. They were reservist officers. So again, the flexibility of the MAD being able to call on reservist officers with specialist skills was really important in this operation.
So forgive me for interrupting. That mixture again of commercial and military expertise.
Yeah, exactly like the staff corps. But these were serving. They weren't Group B type reservists. These were more traditional reserve officers. So they came in and they just helped us do that discipline tempo, diversity of thought, and the resilience forward in Daventry. And they allowed really clear, pragmatic comms. That discipline and tempo is part of telling your operational commander what they need to know, not everything you want them to hear. And they just brought that ability for us to get a really good picture of what was happening in Daventry.
If I may turn with you, please, based on your experience, not only of the pandemic, but your experience prior to the pandemic. You've described some of the problems that were encountered about the bringing on board of Clipper Logistics to deal with the issues with Unipart, the combination of military and commercial expertise. But you also refer in your statement to a theme which has occurred throughout much of this inquiry, which is access to information and data. Could you help us, please, from your point of view and from your vantage point during the pandemic, what were the problems with that for you, and what are the features in the event of a future pandemic that the government and those involved in pandemic planning should be looking for?
So in terms of data, I've already covered the overarching challenge, which is demand and supply. That's the big challenge that any supply chain has to resolve. And as Professor Manners-Bell said, it's about the flow of goods to satisfy both of those. So if you look at demand, you need an understanding of what the demand is, but not just what it is and what it's going to be, what it could be in terms of the pandemic. And as I understand it, some of the exercises prior to the pandemic just hadn't gone far enough in terms of the scale at which the demand signal would go up and the intensity, so how quickly it would go up, so the scale and intensity of that demand signal. And then looking downstream, so looking to the right of Professor Manners-Bell's diagrams, what you'd want to understand is exactly where you've got stock. So there would be some held on the ward, there would be some inevitably held maybe across 3 or 4 wards or just at the trust level. Then you've got the regional distribution centres, and then as you go back, you'd want to know what was being, what was on a train coming across Europe, what was on a ferry coming from China, a ship coming from China, and then you'd want to know what contracts are in place about what you're buying. So once you've got that end-to-end visibility, you can balance your supply and demand. So you can distribute knowing that you're not going to run out because you have confidence in what's coming in.
You refer in your written evidence to the logistics information systems being neither well integrated nor modernised. Is that what you're referring to, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's part of it. So SCCL and Unipart were going to go through a digital transformation later in 2000. So they were carrying it. I don't know what the system was called, but when I talked to Alan Wayne, the Chief Operating Officer, he said we've currently got a lot of green screen technology, which is common, still common across a lot of the industry.
The green screen referring to, I mean, quite literally what is displayed on the screen, older technology.
Yeah, exactly that. So with that system, it's much harder to integrate it with other systems. And you can see with Clipper, they set up their warehouse management system in, I think it's the 4th day, something called Blue Yonder, which allows you to integrate, because it's much more modern, you can integrate it much quicker. That still wouldn't solve the problem of seeing what's in the hospital. So that was a design, that's a deliberate design of the NHS supply chain that you wouldn't see that at the time, not now, I don't think. But it's a deliberate design choice that you don't need to see what's being held by the trusts. And Emily sort of described why that was.
Another observation that you make in your written evidence, and if you'll forgive me, I'll just quote it to you so that I can ask you some questions about it. You say this, you say, I believe the UK government must perfect the balance between outsourcing and internal performance. The matters suitable for outsourcing must be defined and managed, and the matters performed in-house must be critical and provide sovereign capability where it is needed most. Could you unpack that a little bit, please? What is it that you mean by that? Is that a reference to the performance of Unipart and the bringing in of Clipper, or is it something else?
I think it's wider. I think it's what Professor Manners-Bell was talking about when he talked about domestic manufacturing capability, stockpiling, or strategic relationships with your partners. So this is about how you design your supply chain. And it's not, nobody can afford a perfectly resilient supply chain. So it's about risk management and being able to evolve to disruption. And it is worth saying when the NHS would have let the CCL contract, it was 2018 for them to set up in 2019. I think at the time, it seems a different world, but I think at the time we would have believed that we could predict the future, that global supply chains wouldn't be disrupted. And here we are only 5 to 6 years later with global, the global supply chain being disrupted on quite a large scale, and that disruption changing in nature quite frequently. So in order to deliver a supply chain, you have to construct it in the best way possible to be able to take these future disruptions. In 2020, we had COVID. 22, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've had disruption in the Red Sea, and now we've got the tariffs being placed upon various countries. So supply chains now have to adapt. So you have to build it in a way that it can constantly evolve. So creating a sovereign manufacture capability might not be right in 5 years' time, and it's going to be expensive. So how do you manage risk in a whole new way? And it's not so much about looking at the traditional risk and likelihood, likelihood and impact. This is about understanding where your biggest risk is and where you have the ability to do something about it. And just to make sense of that, just linking to Lord Dighton's evidence, when you're going from producing a bin bag to an apron, it's quite a simple transition. So we just need to understand where we have similar to manufacturing capabilities to allow us to scale. But if you're producing an FFP3 in the UK, that's a totally different equation. It needs access to raw materials, processing, and the skills required to make these. So where do you invest? Where do you invest in that capability? Where do you outsource? Is a really sophisticated equation, but it's something we need to pay much more attention to, I think, since 2020 and the global disruption that's happened since.
And just finally, if I may, one of the recommendations or reflections that you make in your witness statement refers to the requirement of logistics excellence and network design, optimized network design. Assuming that in the future, in the event of a future pandemic, that some of this work of logistics and distribution has to be commercially provided, perhaps with the assistance of the military. What is it about those providers of major logistics and distributions that we, the inquiry, my lady, would be looking for?
So I think it goes back to the supply chain design, and in this case, you're looking at the forward distribution design of how you're going to architect the supply chain. So you would be looking for the ability to scale. And the one thing, one of the things that restricted that was the commercial contract with SCCL, but that was, as I've explained, the contract was designed in a very different time when we thought the feature was predictable. You've then got the digital ability to scale, so use of much more modern information systems where you can integrate them with partner systems or just scale into wider capacity. And then you've got the network itself. So some of our larger third-party logistic companies now are partnering and have multiple sites across the United Kingdom. So how do you have the commercial freedoms to scale into those in an affordable manner? So digital, commercial. There's also a mindset piece here, and it's, we've started using wargaming much more in defence. We've done an industry wargame, which has never been done before, to test the upstream supply chain. And I think it came out in previous evidence. I think it was Emily's, but the scale of the stress you put on the supply chain in 2019 would be very different to the scale of the stress you would put on it now. I don't think, actually it was Professor Manners-Bell, I don't think we ever thought that a pandemic would be a global pandemic that would put a global demand signal on the global supply chain. I think we always thought it would be a national pandemic that the global supply chain would have the capacity to respond to. So I think our understanding of the threshold of risk and the scale of risk that we would put on the supply chain in war games has changed in the last 5 years. And I think for every new contract, we have to stress test it with a worst case scenario or a bad day at the office type scenario.
General Prosser, thank you very much. I don't have any further questions for you, but there are some from call participants.
And just before those questions, could I just ask you this, General Prosser? You mentioned the exercises that were conducted, and as you may know, I reported on people not learning lessons from those in my Module 1 report. But by the sounds of it, you're saying they weren't even addressing the right questions. Were the military, do you know, involved in any of the exercises?
I assume they would have been in the same way that other government departments were, but I'm not an expert on them.
Right. Do you know the extent to which logistics were involved in the exercises, or you don't?
I don't, I'm sorry.
Okay, don't worry. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Melody. Good afternoon, General Prosser. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you, yes, thank you.
I ask questions on behalf of the British Medical Association. And for context, the areas of my questions are around an apparent disconnect between the narrative that the UK never ran out of PPE against the experiences of frontline healthcare workers who didn't have what they needed on the front line. And I'd like to refer you, please, to a number of BMA tracker surveys, the first of which is at INQ 000 562 457 _0021. Hopefully you can see that on your screen.
I can say it, yeah,
sorry,
thank
beg
you.
your pardon. General Prosser, these surveys were regularly undertaken by the BMA across its membership during the pandemic. You might be aware the BMA has a membership of approaching 200,000 doctors. The response rate to these surveys was generally several thousand doctors. The graph that you have before you shows the outcomes of several surveys between April and June, and you'll see from a fairly low base provision of PPE to a level that the doctors described as adequate, ticks upwards, but by June you can still see some significant shortages, and you'll see face masks, gowns, aprons only at 68% at that point. Over the page onto page 22, there's a further similar survey, and hopefully you have that. This one is slightly different, becomes a little bit more sophisticated, separates out the types of mask, and takes us into the end of the year, end of 2020. There you'll see in the final column, fluid repellent surgical masks were being provided to an adequate level in 79% of cases, but really quite significant shortages of FFP3 respirators by the end of the year. And it's probably worth making the point that we're yet to go into the second wave and the worst of the pandemic at this point. And then the final graph I'd like to show you is a GP-specific graph over the page on page 23. And this graph is a period of between April and August 2020, and you'll see fairly low levels, lower levels for GPs than in other healthcare settings. And in particular, the final column, in August 2020, gowns, aprons, and face masks were provided to an adequate level in less than 50% of cases. So with that information in mind, General, I note, or the BMA's noted at paragraphs 58 and 59 of your witness statement, you refer to the need to model demand, and you've spoken earlier in your evidence about demand management and reading the signals of demand. And you also mentioned that the demand modelling was carried out with McKinsey and Company, and also a company called Palantir, I think. Can I ask you, in regard to this modelling, how were you able to ensure that the data used in the modelling was accurate? And did that modelling include the type of feedback that we've just gone through from frontline healthcare workers, where you took account of their experience?
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the first thing I'll say is, the mission statement we came up with about making sure that frontline healthcare workers had the trust of the supply chain drove everything that we did. And part of that, and that is an important but subtle change from just delivering goods, because that meant we brought people in to give transparency in our decision making as quickly as possible. And I don't remember looking at the BMA. I personally don't remember looking at the BMA graphs, but I'm sure they would have been looked at, and we had clinicians and some chief execs on the call as well to make sure that representation was made. So we would have taken that into account, but I can't hide from the fact that there were demand and supply chain challenges. The way that the supply chain had been established meant that we didn't have visibility of frontline stock. And I know there was, and you'll understand the end-to-end supply chain, there was challenges across the entire end-to-end supply chain. And I think frontline healthcare workers would have experienced any number of those problems, and the bottlenecks that Professor Manas-Bowles talked about. So what we needed to do was get the data in a good place as quickly as possible. And that meant asking as many people to contribute. We started bringing in a hospital situation report, a SITREP as we would call it. When we did the distribution meetings, 1,800 every single day, we would have a proposed pick list that we would send out to every hospital. They would come back and say, actually, we need more here, we need less here. So we would get that frontline response. We'd then get a combined pick list, which was always a compromise, because there was, I can't avoid the fact that, the data was imperfect and the supply was being disrupted. And then we would send what we needed out. So it wasn't perfect, but at every time that point about the mission statement is really important to me, that we move beyond just delivering stuff. This was about instilling confidence in your membership and the wider frontline healthcare workers. Every single one of them, 100%. So yes, we listened to the feedback and we included as much as we can the feedback.
Thank you, General. Just still on this, in this area, can I ask whether the modelling whether the modelling itself involved demand management, or, to put it another way, rationing?
So the modelling would have described what the demand rate was going to be. The stock position and the inbound supply would have meant, we never used the word rationing. We used centralised distribution to meet demand on a short-term basis. I don't think we ever used that term, but that's what it was. So we never held, rationing would imply that, we've got stuff and we're holding it back. We very rarely held stuff back because it was, in some of the days in April and May, it was very much hand to mouth. But as I stepped through that process, the proposed pick list would have been, look, we've had a look at what usage you're going through. We've had a look at the infection, the waves of infection, if it's going to get worse or going to get better. We've looked at the inbound confidence levels, and this is what we think you need. And immediately the hospitals will then come back and say, have that, preferred, that agreed position. So I'd never used the word rationing. The model would have expressed the demand, and then collectively we would have decided how to get through that stock position over the next 72 hours. And we did that every night at 1800.
Thank you. I'll just move to one final area of questioning, please. This is taken from paragraph 77 of your witness statement. And I'd like to ask you to clarify a particular sentence in that paragraph. And I think it might help if we could bring it up on screen, please. It's INQ 000 560 895_0024. General Prosser, I'd just like to draw your attention to the third sentence of this of paragraph 77. It starts, given the paucity of stock. I hope you can see that.
Yeah, I've got it. Thank you.
I'll just quickly read the sentence for the transcript. The particular passage is, given the paucity of stock, there was often a risk-based approach whereby the SROs would make the decision when stock was needed rather than try and predict where stock was required too far in advance. And just quickly, I think the SROs that you're referring to there would be Emily Lawson, Jonathan Maron, and Lord Dighton. Would that be correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I ask, what were the risks that needed to be balanced? And what type of level or demand triggered a decision that PPE was needed in a particular location?
So the demand was what people were asking for. The risk was that we couldn't treat every hospital individually. We had to look at the entire system. We had to look at everyone who needed PPE. And therefore, this wasn't about individual need, it was about the collective need, and sometimes we had to balance off. When I'm talking about risk, it's where the data and where the hospital was asking us for more stock in order to build a stock position. In some cases, we just didn't have that inbound supply where we had the luxury of creating that stock position. We all wanted that stock position, something in the hospital to reinforce the mission and reinforce our purpose of instilling confidence in the frontline healthcare workers. But the supply position was just too volatile for us to get there. So the risk was, we're going to satisfy your short-term demand for 3 days, and then you're going to have to bear with us because we're going to have to make a decision again tomorrow at 1800. So is that inability to really get ahead of it, get ahead of the supply situation by building stock at the front line.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Ms. Morris, I think you've got some questions.
Thank you, my lady. Major General Prosser, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. One topic, which is around the Clipper arrangements, but sort of two subtopics, if you like. The first around the engagement of Clipper. You've touched already on your answers to questions that Mr. Sharma asked you about your connection with Mr. Ashworth. In your first statement, you said that Mr. Ashworth observed to you that there were, in fact, many logistics companies who would have spare capacity as routine operations they would be conducting, such as deliveries of non-essential shops, would have stopped. And he offered to reach out to Clipper specifically, as he has some contacts with their senior leadership. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. The following day, we understand that Clipper attended a meeting with you, the SCCL, Unipart and NHS England, and they were very quickly engaged, I think within a couple of days, to provide those additional logistics services, and the contracts, the inquiry understands, were worth around £200 million. So my question is around that kind of contact and that procurement process. There was no open procurement process, and Clipper was not on the Crown Services commercial service list. Did Mr. Ashworth, to your knowledge, reach out to anybody other than Clipper as part of that introduction process?
Just before, I don't think he did, to answer the question, but there's a bit of context in there. He mentioned Clipper specifically because they were known to have the agility to do things like this very quickly. I can't think of the examples that he gave now, but I remember him saying how they'd been brought on at really short notice to do retail operations. It wouldn't have been this short. But the thing that marked them out from the other third-party logistic companies was their ability to adapt and react really quickly.
Okay. I guess my question is really why, if there are multiple companies with spare capacity, why did he only contact one with which he had a personal relationship with? You've given an answer to that in part, but do you consider that contacting one to be good practice within contracting for public services, public sector services?
So if you ask me today, where we are now, absolutely not. If you ask me on Sunday the 21st of March, I would say yes, because I'd received emails on the saying that we were within 24 hours of the supply chain reaching capacity and not being able to survive, not being able to deliver goods. Remember Emily Lawson's statement on the 14th of March, say hospitals are going to Screwfix to buy goggles. On the 16th of March, Oxford says they're down to 2 days of gowns and masks. This was a really urgent situation. I didn't make any decision. What I did was connect Mr. Ashworth and Clipper Logistics to the logistics experts of the NHS, and they took the decision away.
Understand that, thank you. Second topic, still asking about Clipper though. This is about their inbound supplies. On the 6th of May, so moving forward some sort of 6 weeks into your time, you emailed, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Dutton regarding a concern around the capacity that Clipper had. I think you were informed that there was 50 plus vehicles that were inbound in the next 24 hours, and there was concerns around product details, POs, are they product orders?
Purchase orders.
Purchase orders, thank you. And generally that there'd be an issue about moving stock off the dock and identifying what was there and how to move it forward. You said it sounded like chaos, and that there's a reference by you to do more work needs to be done around the inbound logistics data. Does this show that the data problems you'd identified persisted even 6 weeks after you'd started work, and there was a lack of paperwork and clarity around inbound supplies?
So a lot of the goods arriving on the 6th of May would have been procured much earlier. So the purchase orders would have been completed much earlier. Once complete, we'd have captured the data probably on Excel in the early days and then moved on to the next deal. So the consequence of poor paperwork much earlier than the 6th of May was now manifested in itself.
Okay. Was this an issue caused by the suppliers or by NHS England systems? You mentioned Excel spreadsheets, not being able to sort of keep track of anticipated deliveries, or is it still a legacy problem?
So I think it was all of that. So this is new suppliers, new buy team, suppliers providing multiple customers. So all of that friction in the supply base was now manifesting itself in a number of different ways. So when you go to a new supplier, would have gone through as much due diligence, and Andy Wood and Gareth Rhys-Williams have gone through that in some detail. Would have gone through the due diligence, but you can't get away from the fact we were entering contracts much quicker than ever before. So there was, some of the paperwork was not as perfect as it could have been.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Very grateful. That completes the questions we have for you, General Prosser. It's not the first time that I've heard about the critical role that the military played during our response to the pandemic, but I think it's the first time I've had a serving member of the Armed Forces to be able to thank. I've not just this module, but I've heard it in other modules, and I don't know if you heard Mark Drake for talking about the role of the military in Wales, where I think you might have a connection. But what you did to try and get PPE to frontline healthcare workers and to their patients when they were desperate was amazing. So thank you very much indeed for your help to them on their behalf, and thank you for your extraordinarily helpful evidence to the inquiry.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. I shall adjourn now, I think, Mr Sharma?
Yes, my lady.
10 o'clock tomorrow. Can I warn all the call participants, and I'm sorry about this, but instead of just having a day of closing submissions, we have to have a witness who was too ill to attend previously, and that means that we're going to be tight for time, and I'm going to have to be very grumpy about making people keep to their time limits. 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.